right, welcome. We're starting here today our second part of our series, Cultivating People Who Give. Today we're talking about generosity, the fountain of giving. Now, I used to live in an old building. Anytime I ran the water fountain, this reddish brown water would come out for a few seconds before the water eventually became clear. So for a while, I'd just run the water, and once all that rust water was gone and it got clear, I'd fill my mug and then drink some water. But even though the water was clear, it still had an unmistakable metallic taste. One night, I decided I'd run an experiment. I filled my mug with water, and I left it in front of a box fan overnight so that the water would evaporate. The next morning, my worst fears were confirmed. The water evaporated from the mug, and left inside it looked like a gymnast had spread his hand chalk all over the inside and then threw in a dash of glitter. The fountain in that old building produced contaminated water. It didn't matter how many mugs I tried to fill, the water was bad because the fountain was bad. Feeling disgusted about all the metal I had been drinking from that fountain, I sought a new source for water. Now today, we're talking about generosity and giving, and the quality of your giving will be determined by the kind of fountain that you possess. The fountain for all your actions is your heart. What you do with your money will depend on the kind of heart that you have. So when it comes to giving, there's a kind of heart that produces clean, refreshing, life-giving water. And there's a kind of heart that produces contaminated, metallic rust water. As believers, we want to have the right fountain concerning our money. We want to have the right kind of heart, not a greedy heart, but a generous heart. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to open our Bibles to contrast a greedy heart with a generous heart. And then we're going to apply this to our lives. So let's talk for a bit about a greedy heart. In the book of Luke, chapter 12, we'll go to Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. Jesus tells a parable saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began thinking to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' And he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And I will store all my grain and all my goods there. And I will say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years to come. Relax, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is demanded of you. And as for all that you have prepared, who will own it now? Such is the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich in relation to God.'" This is a sad story of someone who spent their life storing up treasure for himself and was unprepared to face God at the time of their death. And the lesson Jesus wants us to learn is actually in Luke 12, verse 15. "But he said to them, 'Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one is affluent does his life consist of his possessions.'" You know, I used to work in the storage industry, and people would spend tens of thousands of dollars throughout their lives to store their excess goods. Inevitably, these people would die. So many times I watched as the family of the deceased cleaned out these giant storage units, emptying all the junk into dumpsters with tears in their eyes. Even sadder yet, there were people who did not have close family or relatives, and their stuff would be auctioned off. And it'd be auctioned off to buyers who wanted to turn a profit by reselling the collection of their life. So these people, they'd spend so much money on their stuff and even more money storing all their stuff. And at the end of their lives, all that stuff ended up in dumpsters or in the hands of strangers. Jesus warns against all kinds of greed because in the end, everyone will die and all their money and all their possessions will be left behind. They will stand before God empty-handed because they only collected earthly treasure. Beware a greedy heart, lest you be like the man in the parable. And God called out and said, "You fool, this very night your soul is demanded of you." So we don't want a greedy heart, but we want a generous heart. 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 contain an extended passage on giving where Paul urges the Corinthians to be generous givers. We're going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and we're going to work our way through verses 5 through 13 to learn the importance of having a generous heart. So 2 Corinthians 9 verse 5 says, "So I considered it necessary to urge the brothers that they go on ahead to you and arrange in advance your previously promised generous gift, that the same would be ready as a generous gift, and not as one grudgingly given due to greediness." There's something very important to point out in this verse. The Apostle Paul did not just care that they gave the gift they promised. He cared about how they would give it. He cared about their hearts. He sent the brothers ahead because he wanted the Corinthians to give with generous hearts, not with greedy hearts. And the Apostle Paul, he gives three reasons. Three reasons why they should give with generous hearts. So the first reason is they should give generously because God loves it. Verses 6 and 7 say, "Now I say this, the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows generously will also reap generously. Each one must do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." The Apostle Paul is saying the Corinthians should give cheerfully and generously because God loves it. It's that simple. God loves it when believers give with generous hearts. God loves it when you give with a generous heart. So give cheerfully and generously simply because God loves it. The second reason, they should give generously because God will make them spiritually rich. God will make them spiritually rich. Verses 8 and through 10 say, "And God is able to make all grace overflow to you, so that having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As it is written, He scattered abroad, He gave to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. Now He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness." The Apostle Paul tells the Corinthians to give generously so that they may have an abundance for every good deed, and that God would increase the harvest of their righteousness. So that means that as they give, they will receive spiritual benefits. They're trading away their earthly riches and instead gaining spiritual riches. And this is true for believers today as well. As you give generously, God will increase the harvest of your righteousness. And so you give generously so that you can be spiritually rich. So the first reason is they should give generously because God loves it. The second was that they should give generously because God makes them spiritually rich. And this third reason why they should give generously is because it will result in thanksgiving to God. 2 Corinthians 9, verses 11 through 13 say, "You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all." So the Apostle Paul is showing the Corinthians that their gifts, it goes far beyond fulfilling a need. Their generous gifts will overflow through many thanksgivings to God, and the recipients will glorify God for their obedience and their confession to the gospel of Christ. And so what he's saying is, when you give to fulfill a need, yes, it fulfills that need, but those people then are going to thank God. It's going to result in the praise and the worship of God. So when you give your gift, God gets more glory. He gets more praise. He gets more thanksgivings because you gave. So when believers give generously, it does more than meet an earthly need. It results in worship. It brings God glory through the thanksgiving that overflows from those blessed by the gifts. So generously give. Give to meet the need, but more than that, give generously because it will produce thanksgiving to God. So in conclusion, giving matters. And even more than that, giving with the right heart matters. The Apostle Paul cared enough about the Corinthians to not only accept their gift, but to make sure they gave with the right heart. A greedy heart is like a rusty fountain. It's an unhealthy heart that will produce little good. But a generous heart, it's like a fountain of pure water. God takes joy in it. The fountain enriches all, and it ultimately results in thanksgiving to God. So take care that you cultivate a generous heart. If you are struggling to have a generous heart, meditate on the gospel. Meditate on Romans 8, 31 through 39, to see the incredible love of God as he gave us his Son and graciously gives us all things. Meditate on how Jesus gave his very life for you. Meditate on how God became a man, made in flesh, born of a woman, and that he was humbled himself, taking the form of a servant. And then he died on a cross, and he died for you. Meditate on that and pray that God would give you a heart like his, a generous heart. All right, so we have some discussion questions. Now, these discussion questions, if you have someone you can discuss these with, I think that would be really good. But Otherwise, just write them down and think about these questions on your own. So I've got 4 questions for you. So the first question is this. In what ways do you see greed show up in your heart? In what ways do you see greed show up in your heart? The second question is, when you receive a surplus of money, what's the first thing you think to spend it on? So say you get a gift, a birthday gift, a Christmas gift, or something good happens where a surplus of money comes in. Where does your mind go to? What's that first thing you think of to spend your money on? The third question is, when do you find yourself feeling generous? When do you find yourself feeling generous? So think about it. When you're giving, when you're moved to give, what sorts of things really drive your heart to generosity? That's something to think about. And then the last question is, what can you do this week to cultivate a heart of generosity? What can you do this week to cultivate a heart of generosity? And I want to give you some options. One, like I said, is meditate on the gospel. Another one could be praying with your spouse or praying with a friend about how you can be more generous. Maybe around this holiday season, you can consider, how can I give above and beyond this holiday season during the season of Christmas? And maybe if you don't already give regularly to church, you can determine, I want to start giving a small amount. And I'm going to be faithful to give that small amount. And don't be surprised that as you start giving, that God will start developing that generous heart inside of you. So those are the questions. In what ways do you see greed show up in your heart? When you receive a surplus of money, what's the first thing you think to spend it on? When do you find yourself feeling generous? And what can you do this week to cultivate a heart of generosity? Thank you.